The summer heat in downtown Phoenix pressed down like a heavy blanket, making the concrete sidewalks shimmer with waves of rising warmth. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked toward the small cafe where he'd arranged to meet his younger brother David. The 28-year-old Marine had just returned from his third deployment overseas, and the adjustment to civilian life, even temporarily, felt more challenging than any mission he'd completed in the field. Marcus carried himself with the unmistakable posture of a military man, shoulders back, head high, steps measured and purposeful. His short-cropped hair and the faded tan lines around his eyes spoke of months spent under foreign suns, wearing protective gear that had become like a second skin. Now, dressed in simple jeans and a polo shirt, he felt almost naked without his uniform, yet the discipline and bearing remained as natural as breathing. The cafe David had chosen sat on a busy corner, its outdoor seating area shaded by large umbrellas that provided little relief from the oppressive heat. As Marcus approached, he spotted his brother already seated at a small table, frantically typing on his laptop while simultaneously scrolling through his phone. David worked as a freelance graphic designer, and his scattered, creative energy had always been the complete opposite of Marcus's methodical approach to life. "You're late," David said without looking up, though his tone carried affection rather than criticism. "Traffic was murder getting here. This city's growing too fast for its own infrastructure." Marcus pulled out the metal chair across from his brother, the legs scraping against the concrete with a sharp sound that made him wince. "Sorry. Still getting used to driving in civilian traffic again. Over there, you either drive fast or you don't drive at all." He sat down and immediately began scanning the area, a habit that had kept him alive through 3 tours of duty. Even in this peaceful setting, his eyes automatically cataloged exit routes, potential threats, and the positions of everyone around them. David finally looked up from his devices, really seeing his brother for the first time since he'd sat down. The younger Thompson brother had their mother's soft features and easy smile, but concern flickered across his face as he studied Marcus. "You look tired, man. Like really tired. When's the last time you slept a full night?" The question hit closer to home than Marcus cared to admit. Sleep had become an elusive luxury, interrupted by dreams that weren't quite nightmares, but weren't peaceful either. Images of faces, some friendly, some hostile, many somewhere in between, would flash through his mind in the quiet hours before dawn. He developed a habit of checking and rechecking locks, of sleeping with his back to a wall, of startling awake at sounds that reminded him of distant places and difficult decisions. "I'm fine," Marcus replied automatically, the same response he'd given to military psychologists and commanding officers. "Just adjusting. It takes time." He picked up the menu, though he wasn't particularly hungry. Food had become fuel during deployment, something consumed quickly and efficiently rather than enjoyed. The idea of sitting leisurely in a cafe, making choices about flavors and preferences, still felt strange and almost wasteful. David studied his brother's face, noting the way Marcus's eyes never quite settled in one place, how his shoulders remained tense even in this casual setting. "Mom's worried about you, you know. She says you barely talked during your visit last week. Just sat on the porch looking out at the street like you were waiting for something to happen." Their mother, Elena Thompson, had raised 2 boys on her own after their father died in a construction accident when Marcus was 15 and David was 12. She'd worked double shifts at the hospital as a nurse, somehow managing to attend every school event and provide the stability they'd needed. Marcus joining the Marines right after high school had been her greatest pride, and deepest fear rolled into one overwhelming emotion. "I'm just taking things slow," Marcus said, finally, making eye contact with his brother. "Try to figure out what comes next. The Corps has been my life for 10 years. Everything I know, everything I'm good at, it all revolves around service. Civilian life is different." The waiter approached their table, a young man, probably David's age, with an easy smile and the kind of carefree energy that Marcus remembered having once, before the weight of responsibility and Experience had settled on his shoulders like armor he couldn't remove. Marcus ordered coffee, black, while David requested an elaborate iced drink with multiple modifications that made the waiter scribble frantically on his notepad. As they waited for their drinks, David leaned forward, lowering his voice. Have you thought about what you want to do? I mean, long term. You've got skills, experience, leadership training. Companies are always looking for people with military backgrounds. Marcus appreciated his brother's concern, but the question felt overwhelming. In the military, his purpose had been clear, his role defined, his mission always laid out in precise detail. Now, faced with infinite possibilities and no clear objective, he felt adrift in a way that combat had never made him feel. At least in war zones, he'd known who he was and what was expected of him. I've been thinking about it, he said, which was true, though his thoughts had been circular and unproductive. Maybe something in security or law enforcement. Something where the training translates directly. What he didn't mention was the growing sense that none of those paths felt right, that he was looking for something he couldn't quite name or define. Their drinks arrived, and David immediately dove into conversation about his latest projects, his girlfriend Sarah, and the new apartment they were considering together. Marcus listened, genuinely interested in his brother's life, but part of his attention remained fixed on his surroundings. It was then that he noticed the elderly woman. She sat alone at a table near the cafe's front window, her back straight despite her obvious age. Her white hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she wore a simple blue blouse with dark slacks that had been pressed to sharp creases. Everything about her appearance suggested careful attention to detail, a pride in presentation that reminded Marcus of the senior officers he'd most respected. She held a cup of tea with both hands, steam rising gently from the surface, and stared out the window with an expression that seemed to contain decades of memories. Something about her posture, the way she held herself, caught Marcus's attention in a way he couldn't immediately explain. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to respect, to being listened to when she spoke. Yet she sat completely alone, and Marcus found himself wondering about her story, about what had brought her to this cafe on this blazing hot afternoon. Earth to Marcus, David's voice cut through his observations. You're doing that thing again. What thing? That scanning thing. The way you look at everything like you're planning an escape route, or checking for snipers. It's kind of unsettling, actually. Marcus forced his attention back to his brother, though his peripheral vision remained aware of the elderly woman's presence. Saw the old habits. Maybe you should talk to someone, David suggested gently. Like professionally. There are people who specialize in helping veterans adjust. It's not a sign of weakness or anything. Sarah's cousin went through something similar after he came back from Afghanistan. The suggestion wasn't new. Marcus had heard it from his mother, from former colleagues, even from his commanding officer during his exit interviews. But seeking help felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that he couldn't handle the transition on his own. The Marine Corps had trained him to be self-sufficient, to solve problems through discipline and determination. The idea of sitting in an office talking about his feelings went against everything he'd learned about strength and resilience. I'll think about it, he said, the same non-committal response he'd given everyone else who'd made the suggestion. David seemed to accept this, launching into a story about a difficult client who kept changing the parameters of a logo design project. Marcus tried to focus on the conversation, but his attention kept drifting back to the elderly woman. There was something about her that reminded him of the older civilians he'd encountered overseas, people who had lived through decades of conflict, who had seen their worlds change in ways that younger generations couldn't fully comprehend. As David talked, Marcus found himself studying the woman more closely. Her hands, wrapped around the teacup, showed the spots and wrinkles of advanced age, but they were steady and sure. She wore a simple gold watch on her left wrist, and a plain wedding band that had worn smooth with decades of wear. When she occasionally turned her head to glance around the cafe, Marcus caught glimpses of intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with the same kind of awareness he'd developed through military training. The afternoon wore on, with David eventually transitioning from work stories to relationship updates. He and Sarah were seriously discussing marriage, possibly by the end of the year, and he wanted Marcus to be his best man. The request touched Marcus more deeply than he'd expected. The idea of standing beside his brother on such an important day, of being trusted with such a significant role in his life, felt like an anchor to something real and meaningful. Of course, Marcus said, surprised by the emotion that colored his voice. "I'd be honored." David grinned, the same lopsided smile he'd had as a kid when he'd accomplished something he was particularly proud of. "Sarah's going to be so relieved. She was worried you might be deployed again or something. She doesn't really understand military schedules." "I'm done with deployments," Marcus said, the finality in his voice surprising even himself. "Whatever I do next, it's going to be here, close to family." The decision had been forming gradually over the past few weeks, but saying it out loud made it feel official, real in a way that internal deliberation hadn't achieved. As they continued talking, Marcus noticed that the elderly woman had finished her tea and was gathering her things. She moved slowly but deliberately, placing items in a small purse with the same careful attention she'd shown in her appearance. When she stood, Marcus realized she was smaller than he'd initially thought, probably no taller than 5 feet, but she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. It was as she was preparing to leave that Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The woman's purse strap had somehow become tangled with her chair, and as she tried to pull it free, the entire chair began to tip backward toward the concrete. In that instant, Marcus saw exactly what was about to happen. The heavy metal chair would crash down, likely taking the elderly woman with it, and the fall could seriously injure someone of her age and apparent fragility. Without thinking, Marcus shot up from his seat, his military training overriding conscious thought. In combat situations, split-second decisions often meant the difference between life and death, and his body had been conditioned to react before his mind finished processing the threat. He moved with the fluid efficiency that had been drilled into him through years of training, covering the distance between their tables in 3 quick steps. But in his urgency to prevent what he saw as an imminent disaster, Marcus misjudged both the situation and his own strength. What he'd perceived as a dangerous fall was actually just a minor entanglement that the woman was perfectly capable of handling herself. His intervention, meant to be helpful, became instead a moment of confusion and embarrassment that would haunt him for days to come. As Marcus reached the woman's table, his momentum and adrenaline-fueled strength carried him forward with more force than the situation required. In his attempt to steady the chair and ensure the woman's safety, he inadvertently bumped into the small side table where she'd placed her empty teacup. The cup, along with the remaining dregs of tea and a small glass of ice water the waiter had brought earlier, went flying. The water arced through the air in what seemed like slow motion, catching the afternoon sunlight before splashing across the elderly woman's carefully pressed blouse and dark slacks. The sound of the glass hitting the concrete seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet cafe, drawing the attention of every patron and staff member in the vicinity. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, horrified by what had just happened. The woman he'd been trying to help now stood dripping wet, her pristine appearance ruined by his clumsy intervention. Her white hair, which had been so neatly arranged, now had damp tendrils sticking to her forehead. Water dripped from her chin onto her shoes, creating small puddles on the concrete around her feet. "Ma'am, I am so sorry," Marcus began, his voice tight with mortification. He reached toward her instinctively, wanting to help, to somehow fix what he'd done, but stopped himself before making the situation worse. I saw the chair tipping, and I thought you were going to fall. I was trying to help, but The elderly woman stood perfectly still for a moment, water still dripping from her clothes, her expression unreadable. Around them, the cafe had fallen into an awkward silence, with servers and other patrons watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and embarrassment. David had risen from their table, and was approaching with wide eyes, clearly trying to process what had just happened to his normally composed brother. "Let me get you some towels," Marcus continued, looking around desperately for a server or anything he could use to help clean up the mess he'd created. "I can pay for dry cleaning or whatever you need. I'm so incredibly sorry. I don't know what happened. I thought I was helping." The woman finally spoke, her voice clear and steady despite the indignity of her situation. "Young man," she said quietly, "I think perhaps you should sit down and take a breath." Her tone wasn't angry or upset, which somehow made Marcus feel worse. There was a calmness to her voice, a control that reminded him of senior military personnel he'd known, people who had learned through experience that panic and emotional reactions rarely improve difficult situations. Her composure in the face of his fumbling apology made his own agitation seem even more pronounced. "Please," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly with the intensity of his regret. "Let me make this right somehow. This isn't who I am. I don't hurt elderly people. I protect them. That's what I was trying to do." A server appeared with an armload of towels, shooting Marcus a look that clearly indicated he thought the younger man had been careless at best, deliberately disrespectful at worst. The server began helping the elderly woman dry off her clothes, speaking to her in soothing tones while pointedly ignoring Marcus's continued attempts to apologize. David finally reached them, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder in a gesture that was both supportive and restraining. "Hey, it was an accident," he said to the server and anyone else within earshot. "My brother was trying to help. He saw the chair moving and thought she was going to fall." But Marcus barely heard his brother's explanation. His attention remained fixed on the elderly woman, who was accepting the server's assistance with the same quiet dignity she'd displayed throughout the incident. As she dabbed at her damp clothing with the offered towels, Marcus caught a glimpse of something that made him look more closely at her left arm. Beneath the wet fabric of her blouse sleeve, he could make out what appeared to be the edge of faded tattoo. It was unusual for a woman of her generation to have any tattoo at all, but this one looked particularly distinctive, clean lines that suggested military precision rather than decorative artwork. Most civilians who got tattoos in that era chose flowers or hearts or other personal symbols. This looked different, more official somehow. Marcus found himself staring, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but the woman finished drying off and adjusted her sleeve before he could get a clearer view. She thanked the server politely, gathered her purse with the same careful movements she'd used throughout the afternoon, and prepared to leave without making eye contact with Marcus again. "Please," Marcus called after her as she walked toward the exit. "At least let me pay for your clothes to be cleaned," or she paused at the cafe entrance, her hand on the door handle, and turned back to look at him. For a moment, their eyes met directly, and Marcus saw something in her gaze that he couldn't immediately identify. Not anger, not disappointment, but something deeper and more complex. It was the look of someone who had seen enough of the world to understand that good intentions sometimes led to poor outcomes, that young people often acted before they fully understood the consequences of their actions. "Thank you for your concern," she said simply, "but that won't be necessary." And with that, she walked out into the blazing Phoenix heat, leaving Marcus standing in the cafe, surrounded by the debris of his good intentions and the stares of strangers who had witnessed his spectacular failure to be helpful. David guided him back to their table, where Marcus slumped into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The adrenaline that had propelled him into action was now leaving his system, replaced by a crushing sense of embarrassment and confusion about his own behavior. What the hell was that? He asked himself as much as his brother. "I saw her having a little trouble with her chair, and I reacted like she was under fire or something, like it was life or death." David sat down across from him, studying his brother's face with growing concern. "Marcus, when's the last time you had a day where you didn't feel like you needed to be ready for some kind of emergency?" The question hit home in a way that Marcus wasn't prepared for. He realized that since returning from his last deployment, he'd been living in a constant state of low-level alertness, always scanning for threats, always ready to spring into action. In a war zone, such vigilance had been necessary for survival. Here, in a peaceful cafe in Phoenix, it had turned him into someone who poured water on elderly women while trying to help them. "I don't know," Marcus admitted quietly. "I don't know how to turn it off." 3 days had passed since the incident at the cafe, but Marcus Thompson couldn't shake the image of the elderly woman standing there dripping wet, looking at him with those calm, knowing eyes. He'd replayed the scene dozens of times in his mind, each repetition making him feel worse about his overreaction and clumsier intervention. Sleep had become even more elusive, with dreams of spilled water mixing uncomfortably with memories of more serious mistakes made under pressure in far more dangerous circumstances. Marcus found himself driving through downtown Phoenix with no particular destination in mind, a habit he'd developed since returning home. The movement and the need to navigate traffic gave his restless mind something to focus on, something concrete and immediate that didn't require him to confront the larger questions about his future that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The city felt different from the places he'd been stationed overseas, but the fundamental challenge remained the same: figuring out how to exist in a space where his hard-earned skills felt either excessive or irrelevant. It was pure chance that led him to park outside the small branch library where he spotted her again. The elderly woman from the cafe sat on a bench in the library's modest garden, reading a thick hardcover book with the same careful attention she'd given to her teeth 3 days earlier. She'd changed clothes, naturally, but her posture remained exactly as Marcus remembered, straight-backed and alert, suggesting someone accustomed to carrying herself with purpose and dignity. Marcus sat in his car for several minutes, engine running, air conditioning fighting against the relentless Arizona heat, debating whether approaching her would make things better or worse. His mother had raised him to take responsibility for his mistakes, to face the consequences of his actions rather than hiding from them. But he also understood that sometimes the best way to help someone was to leave them alone, and he wasn't entirely sure which approach applied in this situation. Finally, his conscience won out over his embarrassment. Marcus turned off the engine, took a deep breath that did little to settle his nerves, and walked across the small parking lot toward the garden where the woman sat reading. As he approached, he could see the title of her book, a biography of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, which struck him as an interesting choice for someone her age. Most elderly people he'd known preferred lighter reading material, romance novels, or mysteries that offered escape rather than historical analysis. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said, stopping a respectful distance from her bench. "I don't want to disturb your reading, but I wanted to apologize again for what happened at the cafe the other day. I've been thinking about it, and I realize I must have seemed completely out of control." The woman looked up from her book, marking her place with a finger before closing it gently. She studied Marcus for a moment, taking in his nervousness and obvious discomfort with the same measured assessment he'd noticed during their first encounter. Her expression remained neutral, neither welcoming nor dismissive, giving him no clear indication of whether his approach was appreciated or unwanted. "You seemed like someone who was trying very hard to help in a situation that didn't actually require assistance," she said finally. Her voice carried the same steady quality he remembered, but this time he detected a slight accent that he couldn't immediately place, something that suggested English wasn't her first language, though she spoke it with complete fluency. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or the oppressive Phoenix sun was unclear. "That's exactly what happened. I saw what I thought was a problem, and I reacted before I really understood the situation. It's something I'm working on, trying to adjust to civilian life where not everything is an emergency that requires immediate action." The woman nodded slowly, and Marcus caught something in her expression that suggested she understood more about his situation than a random civilian might. "You're military," she said, though it was more observation than question. "Marines," Marcus confirmed. "Just back from my 3rd deployment. I'm having some trouble recalibrating, I guess you could say. Afghanistan." The question surprised him with its specificity. Most civilians asked general questions about military service, if they asked anything at all, but she'd gone directly to the current conflict zone with the confidence of someone who paid close attention to world events. Yes, ma'am. Most recently, anyway. I've been back for about a month now, trying to figure out what comes next. The woman gestured to the empty space beside her on the bench. Would you like to sit down? Standing in this heat seems unnecessarily punishing, and I suspect you've been punishing yourself quite enough over a simple accident. Marcus accepted the invitation gratefully, settling onto the bench with the careful movements of someone still adjusting to spaces where he didn't need to remain constantly alert for threats. The shade from the library's small trees provided modest relief from the blazing sun, and the quiet garden felt like a refuge from the busy streets surrounding them. I'm Margaret Kowalski, the woman said, extending her hand with a firm grip that surprised Marcus with its strength. And you are? Marcus Thompson, Mom. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, actually, though I guess that doesn't matter much anymore. It always matters, Margaret said with quiet conviction. Rank represents years of learning, growth, and responsibility. The experiences that earned you that rank don't disappear just because you're no longer wearing the uniform. Something in her tone made Marcus look at her more closely. There was an authority in the way she spoke about military rank, a familiarity that suggested personal experience rather than academic knowledge. Combined with the biography she'd been reading and her immediate recognition of his military background, it painted a picture of someone with deeper connections to the armed forces than might be immediately obvious. Are you military yourself, ma'am? Or married to someone who served? Margaret smiled for the first time since he'd known her, an expression that transformed her entire face and revealed hints of the younger woman she'd once been. Both, actually. I served in the Army for 32 years, retiring as a full colonel in 1987. My husband served as well, though he passed away 5 years ago. Marcus felt his mouth fall open slightly as he processed this information. He'd been worrying for 3 days about accidentally soaking an elderly civilian, never imagining that he'd actually poured water on a retired Army colonel who had served longer than he'd been alive. The revelation recontextualized everything about their encounter, making his overprotective reaction seem even more absurd in retrospect. Colonel, he said, straightening unconsciously into a more respectful posture. I had no idea. I'm even more sorry about what happened. That was completely unacceptable behavior, especially toward a senior officer. Margaret waved away his increased formality with a gesture that was both dismissive and kind. I've been retired for nearly 40 years, Marcus. I think we could dispense with military protocol in a public garden. Besides, you were trying to help, even if your assessment of the situation was somewhat enthusiastic. Despite his lingering embarrassment, Marcus found himself almost smiling at her diplomatic description of his cafe catastrophe. That's probably the kindest way anyone could describe it. My brother said I looked like I was trying to prevent a terrorist attack instead of helping someone untangle a purse strap. Your instincts aren't wrong, Margaret said, settling back against the bench as if preparing for a longer conversation. They're just calibrated for different circumstances than the ones you're encountering now. It's one of the most difficult aspects of transitioning from military to civilian life. Learning to modulate responses that were entirely appropriate in one context, but seem excessive in another. Marcus studied her face, struck by the precision of her observation. You sound like you're speaking from experience. 32 years of active duty, followed by nearly 40 years of civilian life. I've had plenty of time to observe both sides of that particular challenge. Margaret paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. The skills that keep you alive in combat zones, the hypervigilance, the instant assessment of threats, the readiness to act decisively. Those are valuable traits. But they need to be consciously adapted when you're no longer in situations where split-second decisions determine survival. The validation in her words hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. For weeks, he'd been feeling like his military training was something he needed to suppress or overcome rather than adapt. Everyone from his mother to his brother to well-meaning friends had suggested that he needed to leave the war behind or learn to relax. Advice that had left him feeling like fundamental parts of his identity were somehow problematic. How do you make that adjustment? Marcus asked. I mean, I know intellectually that I'm not in a war zone anymore, but my body doesn't seem to have gotten the message. I scan every room I enter, I sleep with my back to the wall, and apparently I treat minor inconveniences like major emergencies. Margaret considered his question seriously, her gaze drifting to the small fountain in the center of the garden where water bubbled peacefully over smooth stones. The first thing to understand is that you're not broken, and you don't need to completely rebuild yourself from scratch. Those instincts served you well, and they'll continue to serve you in different ways. The key is learning to consciously engage them rather than letting them run automatically. She turned back to face him, her expression combining the warmth of a grandmother with the authority of a career military officer. Tell me about what you were thinking in that moment at the cafe. Walk me through your assessment of the situation. Marcus thought back to those few seconds when everything had gone wrong, trying to reconstruct his thought process from that afternoon. I saw you having trouble with your chair, and it looked like it was going to tip backward. He paused, realizing that mentioning her age might be insensitive. Given that I'm an old woman who might be seriously injured by a fall. Margaret completed his thought with amusement. It's all right to acknowledge reality. Marcus, I'm 78 years old, and a fall backward on a concrete would indeed have been potentially serious. Right? So I saw what I thought was an immediate physical threat to someone who might be vulnerable, and I reacted to neutralize that threat as quickly as possible. Except the threat wasn't as serious as I thought, and my intervention created a bigger problem than the one I was trying to solve. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's an excellent tactical analysis. Your assessment of potential risk was reasonable, your desire to help was admirable, and your speed of response was impressive. The only real error was in the execution. You moved with more force than the situation required, which led to unintended consequences. Hearing his actions broken down in military terms, analyzed as a tactical decision rather than a personal failure, gave Marcus a different perspective on what had happened. He'd been beating himself up for 3 days, but Margaret's analysis suggested that his fundamental approach had been sound, even if the results had been embarrassing. So how do I learn to recalibrate the force of my responses? He asked. Practice, Margaret said simply. Conscious, deliberate practice in lower-stakes situations. You need to retrain your reflexes to match your current environment, which means putting yourself in situations where you can practice assessing threats accurately and responding proportionally. Marcus frowned, not entirely sure what she meant. What kind of practice? Margaret smiled, expression that suggested she had specific ideas in mind. How much do you know about your local community, Marcus? About the challenges facing civilians here in Phoenix, particularly elderly civilians or other vulnerable populations. The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Marcus wasn't sure how to answer. Since returning from deployment, he'd been focused primarily on his own adjustment challenges, spending time with family, but not really engaging with the broader community around him. His world had essentially shrunk to his apartment, his family's homes, and the few public spaces where he felt comfortable enough to practice being around civilians. Not much, honestly, he admitted. I've been kind of focused on figuring out my own situation. That's understandable, but it might be part of why you're struggling, Margaret suggested. In the military, your purpose was clear. Protect your unit, complete your mission, serve your country. Those are meaningful goals that give structure and direction to everything you do. Without a similar sense of purpose in civilian life, it's easy to feel lost or disconnected. Marcus realized she was describing exactly how he'd been feeling, though he'd never articulated it quite that way. So, you're suggesting I need to find a new mission? I'm suggesting you might benefit from finding ways to use your protective instincts and leadership skills in service of your civilian community, Margaret clarified. There are plenty of people who could use help from someone with your training and experience, and helping them might give you the sense of purpose you're missing while also providing opportunities to practice appropriate responses to civilian situations. The idea was intriguing, though Marcus wasn't entirely sure what it would look like in practice. What kind of help do you mean? Margaret shifted on the bench, turning to face him more directly. There's a senior center about 6 blocks from here where I volunteer twice a week. Many of the people who come there are veterans themselves, from Korea, Vietnam, even a few from World War II. They're dealing with their own adjustment challenges: aging, isolation, health problems, financial difficulties. Some of them could use practical help with things like home repairs, transportation, or navigating bureaucratic systems. Others just need someone to listen to their stories. You think I should volunteer at a senior center? Marcus asked, try to imagine himself in that role. It would give you practice interacting with civilians in a helping capacity, but in situations where your military experience would be seen as an asset rather than something you need to hide or suppress. And it might help you understand that the protective instincts you developed in the military can be just as valuable in peaceful contexts. Marcus found himself genuinely considering the suggestion. The idea of helping other veterans appealed to him, and Margaret was right that it would provide opportunities to practice civilian interactions in a structured environment. Plus, working with elderly people might help him learn to assess their actual needs rather than projecting his own assumptions about their fragility. What would I actually do there? He asked. Whatever needs doing, Margaret said with a shrug. Sometimes it means helping someone figure out their Medicare paperwork or driving them to medical appointments. Sometimes it means fixing a leaky faucet or changing light bulbs in fixtures they can't reach safely. And sometimes it means sitting with someone who hasn't had a real conversation in weeks and listening to them talk about their grandchildren or their memories of places that don't exist anymore. The variety of tasks sounded manageable, even appealing. Marcus had always found satisfaction in solving practical problems, and the idea of using his skills to help people who might otherwise struggle alone resonated with something deep in his sense of purpose. Would I want help from someone like me? He asked. I mean, I don't exactly have a great track record with elderly people lately. Margaret laughed, a sound that was both warm and slightly mischievous. Marcus, you doused me with water while trying to prevent what you thought was an accident that could have seriously injured me. If I can forgive you for that, I think the folks at the senior center can handle whatever social awkwardness you might bring to volunteer work. Her point was well taken, and Marcus found himself actually looking forward to the possibility of doing something useful with his time. When would I start? I'm going there tomorrow afternoon around 2 o'clock, Margaret said, standing up from a bench and gathering her book. If you're interested, you could meet me there, and I'll introduce you to the director. No commitment beyond seeing what it's like and whether it feels like something you'd want to pursue. Marcus stood as well, feeling for the first time in weeks like he had something concrete to look forward to. I'll be there. And Margaret, thank you for not being angry about the cafe and for this conversation. I feel like I understand things a little better now. Margaret smiled and extended her hand again, the same firm handshake she'd offered when they'd first properly introduced themselves. See you tomorrow, Marcus. And try not to worry so much about being perfect. Good intentions combined with a willingness to learn from mistakes will take you further than you might think. As Marcus watched her walk away toward the library entrance, he realized that his perspective on the cafe incident had shifted completely. What had felt like a humiliating failure now seemed like the beginning of something potentially meaningful, a connection with someone who understood his background and could help him find productive ways to channel the skills and instincts that had kept him alive overseas. For the first time since returning from deployment, Marcus felt like he might have found a direction forward, a way to bridge the gap between who he'd been in the military and who he might become as a civilian. The protective instincts that had gotten him into trouble at the cafe weren't flaws to be suppressed. They were assets to be channeled appropriately. Tomorrow, he would take the first step toward learning how to do that. Marcus arrived at the Sunset Vista Senior Center 15 minutes early, a habit ingrained through years of military punctuality that he'd never quite managed to shake. The building sat on a quiet street lined with mature palm trees, their fronds providing generous shade that made the afternoon heat more tolerable. From the outside, the center looked like a converted community center or small school, with wheelchair-accessible ramps and cheerfully painted walls that suggested a place where people came by choice rather than necessity. He sat in his car for a few minutes, watching the steady stream of elderly people moving in and out of the building. Some walked with confidence and energy, chatting with friends as they arrived for afternoon activities. Others moved more slowly, using walkers or canes, but still maintaining the dignity and independence that Marcus had observed in Margaret. A few were dropped off by younger family members who helped them to the entrance before driving away, presumably to pick them up later. The diversity of the people he observed challenged some of Marcus's unconscious assumptions about senior centers. He'd been imagining a depressing place filled with frail, passive, elderly people waiting for someone to take care of them. Instead, this looked like a vibrant community hub where active adults gathered for social interaction and mutual support. Several of the men wore caps or T-shirts indicating military service, and Marcus found himself wondering about their stories, their own experiences with deployment and return, adjustment, and purpose. At exactly 2 o'clock, Marcus spotted Margaret walking across the parking lot from the direction of the bus stop. She moved with the same purposeful stride he'd observed at the library, carrying a large canvas bag that appeared to be filled with books and papers. She wore a simple yellow blouse and dark pants, with comfortable walking shoes that suggested someone who spent considerable time on her feet. When she saw Marcus getting out of his car, she waved and changed direction to meet him. "Right on time," she said approvingly. "That's a good sign. The folks here appreciate reliability." "Marine training," Marcus replied. "Early is on time is late, and late is unacceptable." Margaret chuckled as they walked toward the entrance together. "You'll fit in well here. A lot of our volunteers and participants come from military backgrounds, and they have similar approaches to punctuality and follow-through." The interior of the senior center exceeded Marcus's expectations in every way. The main lobby was bright and welcoming, with comfortable seating areas arranged around low tables covered with magazines, newspapers, and informational brochures. The walls displayed a mixture of community announcements, photographs from recent events, and artwork that appeared to have been created by the center's participants. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but it felt lived in rather than institutional. "Margaret, there you are," called a woman from behind the main desk. She appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of warm smile that suggested someone who genuinely enjoyed working with people. "And you brought a friend?" "Carol, I'd like you to meet Marcus Thompson," Margaret said, guiding him toward the desk. "He's the young Marine I mentioned who might be interested in volunteering with us." Carol came around the desk to shake Marcus's hand, her grip firm and welcoming. "It's wonderful to meet you, Marcus. We can always use help here, especially from someone with your background. A lot of our participants are veterans themselves, and they appreciate being able to connect with someone who understands military culture." Marcus felt some of his nervousness ease at Carol's straightforward welcome. Margaret mentioned that there might be opportunities to help with practical things, transportation, home repairs, that kind of work. "Absolutely," Carol confirmed. "We have a whole list of people who could use assistance with various projects. Some are simple things like changing smoke detector batteries or helping rearrange furniture. Others are more involved, like minor home repairs or yard work. And then there are the ongoing needs, people who need regular transportation to medical appointments or grocery shopping." "What would be the time commitment?" Marcus asked, trying to get a sense of what he'd be taking on. "That's entirely up to you," Carol said. "Some volunteers come in once a week for a few hours. Others prefer to take on specific projects as they arise. We're grateful for any time people can offer, and we try to match volunteers with opportunities that fit their schedules and interests." Margaret spoke up from beside him. "Why don't I show Marcus around, introduce him to some people, and let him get a feel for what we do here? Then he can decide what level of involvement feels right." Carol nodded enthusiastically. "Perfect. Marcus, take all the time you need to look around and ask questions. And please don't feel any pressure to commit to anything today. We want volunteers who are here because they want to be, not because they feel obligated. as Margaret led him away from the front desk. Marcus found himself impressed by the center's approach. The lack of pressure felt refreshing after weeks of well-meaning, but pushy advice from family members and friends about what he should do with his life. Here, he could explore an opportunity without feeling like he was disappointing people if it didn't turn out to be the right fit. The main activity room is through here, Margaret explained, guiding him down a wide hallway lined with bulletin boards and photographs. Today is book club day, but we also have exercise classes, art workshops, computer training, and social events throughout the week. They entered a large, sunny room where about 20 people sat in a circle discussing what appeared to be a historical novel. The participants ranged in age from what Marcus guessed was early 60s to well into their 80s, and the conversation was lively and engaged. He could hear fragments of discussion about character motivation, historical accuracy, and connections to current events. "That's our most popular book club," Margaret whispered. "They prefer historical fiction and biographies. Very serious readers who don't hesitate to argue with authors who get military or historical details wrong." Marcus smiled, imagining the kind of spirited discussions that must arise when a group of well-read seniors encountered factual errors in books they were reviewing. "Do you participate in the book club?" "When my schedule allows," Margaret replied, "though I tend to be more interested in military history and memoirs than novels. I find real stories more compelling than made-up ones." They continued through the center, with Margaret pointing out a computer room where several elderly people were working on laptops with the help of younger volunteers, a craft room where a small group was working on what appeared to be a community quilt project, and a kitchen area where volunteers prepared simple meals and snacks for people who came to the center. "The meal program is especially important," Margaret explained as they observed two volunteers assembling sandwiches and soup. "A lot of our participants live alone, and this might be their main social meal of the day. It's not just about nutrition, it's about having people to eat with, conversation during meals, the basic human need for community." Marcus found himself thinking about his own meals since returning from deployment. He'd been eating alone most of the time, either in his apartment or occasionally with his family, but he hadn't really considered how isolation during meals might be affecting his own adjustment to civilian life. In the military, meals have been communal events, times for decompression and connection with his unit. Perhaps part of his current restlessness stemmed from the loss of that built-in community structure. "Is there a particular area where you think I might be most helpful?" Marcus asked as they continued their tour. Margaret paused outside a door marked Transportation Coordination and gestured for him to look inside. A large wall calendar was covered with appointments and notes, while a desk held stacks of paperwork and a phone that seemed to ring constantly. A harried-looking volunteer in her 40s was juggling multiple phone conversations while making notes on the calendar. "Transportation is probably our biggest ongoing need," Margaret said. "A lot of our participants can no longer drive safely, but they still need to get to medical appointments, grocery stores, pharmacies. Family members help when they can, but adult children often live far away or have work schedules that don't allow for daytime transportation assistance." Marcus watched the volunteer field phone calls for a few minutes, beginning to understand the scope of the challenge. Each appointment request required coordination with available volunteers, consideration of vehicle capacity and wheelchair accessibility, and scheduling that accounted for medical appointment duration and travel time. "How many people need regular transportation help?" he asked. "On any given day, probably 15 to 20, Margaret replied. "And that's just the people we're already serving. There are others in the community who could use help, but haven't asked for it yet, either because they don't know we exist or because they're too proud to admit they need assistance." The transportation coordinator looked up from her desk as they lingered in the doorway, and Margaret introduced Marcus as a potential new volunteer. The woman's face lit up with hope and relief. "Oh, please tell me you have a reliable vehicle and a flexible schedule," she said, only half joking. "I've got 3 medical appointments this Thursday that I can't cover, and 2 grocery shopping trips that have been postponed twice already." Marcus felt the familiar stirring of purpose that came from being presented with a clear problem that needed solving. "I have a pickup truck and plenty of time," he said. "What would be involved in helping with transportation?" "Background check, basic training on working with elderly and disabled passengers, and understanding of our protocol for medical appointments and emergency procedures," the coordinator explained. "But honestly, the most important qualifications are reliability, patience, and a willingness to treat our participants with dignity and respect." "Those I can do," Marcus assured her, surprising himself with how quickly he'd moved from considering volunteer work to actively pursuing it. Margaret smiled at his enthusiasm, but suggested they continue the tour before he committed to anything specific. "Let's see the rest of the facility, and then you can decide which areas interest you most." They visited the administrative offices, where Marcus learned about the center's funding sources and operational challenges, and a quiet room designated for one-on-one counseling and support services. This room was where staff members met with participants who were dealing with grief, financial difficulties, health crises, or family problems that required more specialized attention than group activities could provide. "We have a social worker who comes in 3 days a week," Margaret explained, "but there's always more need than there are professional resources to address it. Sometimes people just need someone to listen while they work through difficult decisions or process major life changes." As they walked, Margaret introduced Marcus to other volunteers and several participants, always mentioning his military background. Marcus was struck by how many people immediately connected with him on that basis, sharing their own service histories or asking about his experiences overseas. The conversations were brief but warm, creating an immediate sense of belonging that he hadn't experienced since leaving the military. One conversation in particular stayed with him. They encountered an elderly man named Frank who was struggling to assemble a new bookshelf in one of the reading areas. Frank had served in Vietnam as an Army engineer, and his hand shook slightly as he tried to manipulate the small screws and hardware required for assembly. "These damn instructions might as well be written in Sanskrit," Frank muttered as Marcus approached. "And my hands don't work like they used to. Mind if I take a look?" Marcus asked, kneeling down beside the partially assembled shelving unit. What followed was a 15-minute collaboration that felt completely natural to both men. Marcus handled the fine motor tasks that Frank's arthritis made difficult, while Frank provided guidance based on his engineering experience and familiarity with furniture assembly. They worked together with the easy rhythm of people who understood each other's capabilities and limitations, neither offering help that wasn't needed nor accepting assistance that felt demeaning. "You've got good hands for this kind of work," Frank observed as Marcus secured the final shelf bracket. "And you listen to instructions instead of just charging ahead with your own ideas." "Learned that the hard way in the Marines," Marcus replied. "Senior enlisted taught me that listening to people with more experience was usually smarter than trying to figure everything out myself." Frank chuckled and clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "Margaret, you better grab this one before someone else figures out he's useful." The interaction left Marcus feeling more confident about his ability to contribute meaningfully at the senior center. Working with Frank had felt comfortable and productive, a reminder that his military training had taught him valuable skills beyond combat readiness. The patience, attention to detail, and respect for experience that had served him well in the Marines were directly applicable to volunteer work with elderly civilians. As their tour concluded, Margaret guided Marcus back to the main lobby, where Carol was waiting with a folder of information about volunteer opportunities and application procedures. "So what do you think?" Carol asked. "Did anything you saw today appeal to you?" Marcus looked around the bustling center, observing the variety of activities and interactions taking place simultaneously. "All of it, honestly. The transportation coordination looks like something where I could make a real difference. And I enjoyed working with Frank on that bookshelf project. But I'd also be interested in learning about the other ways to help." "We can start you with transportation and see how that goes," Carol suggested. "It's a good way to get to know our participants and understand their broader needs. Often, driving someone to a medical appointment leads to discovering other ways you might be able to help them. Margaret nodded approvingly. Transportation volunteers often become some of our most valuable resources because they develop relationships with the people they're helping. Those relationships provide insights into problems that might not be obvious during group activities here at the center. Marcus accepted the folder of information and agreed to complete the application process, including the required background check and training sessions. As he prepared to leave, several people he'd met during the tour made a point of telling him they looked forward to seeing him again, creating a sense of anticipation about returning that he hadn't felt about anything in weeks. "Thank you," he said to Margaret as they walked toward the parking lot together. "This feels like something I could really get into, something that matters." "I think it will be good for everyone involved," Margaret replied. "The center needs reliable volunteers with practical skills, and you need opportunities to use your training in positive ways. It's a natural fit." As Marcus drove home that afternoon, he found himself thinking not about his own adjustment challenges, but about the specific transportation requests he might be able to help with, the practical problems he could solve, and the connections he might develop with other veterans who understood his background and experiences. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt like he was moving towards something meaningful rather than simply trying to escape from something that no longer fit. The protective instincts that had gotten him into trouble at the cafe weren't flaws to be suppressed. They were assets to be channeled toward people who actually needed protection and assistance. Tomorrow, he would begin the application process to become a volunteer. Next week, he would complete the required training. And soon after that, he would start driving elderly veterans and other community members to medical appointments, grocery stores, and other essential destinations. It wasn't a traditional career path, and it wouldn't solve all of his transition challenges overnight, but it felt like a step in the right direction. More importantly, it felt like a way to maintain his sense of purpose and service while learning to adapt his military skills to civilian needs. Marcus realized he was actually looking forward to Monday morning for the first time in months. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson had become an integral part of the Sunset Vista Senior Center community. What had started as tentative volunteer work had evolved into something approaching a second career, though one that paid in satisfaction rather than salary. He'd completed additional training in elder care, crisis intervention, and community resource navigation, becoming one of the center's most requested and reliable volunteers. The transformation in Marcus's daily life had been gradual but profound. Instead of waking up with no clear purpose beyond getting through another day, he now started each morning by checking his phone for transportation requests, reviewing the day's scheduled appointments, and planning the most efficient routes between medical facilities, pharmacies, and grocery stores. His military training in logistics and coordination had found new application in civilian service, giving him the sense of mission and structure he'd been missing since leaving active duty. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus was preparing for what had become one of his favorite weekly assignments, driving Margaret to her regular medical appointments. What had begun as a simple transportation arrangement had developed into something much deeper, a mentoring relationship that benefited both of them in ways neither had initially anticipated. Margaret emerged from her small apartment building at exactly 9 o'clock, as punctual as always, carrying her usual canvas bag and walking with the steady pace Marcus had come to associate with her approach to everything in life. At 78, she remained remarkably independent, but her willingness to accept help with transportation had taught Marcus valuable lessons about the difference between being helpful and being patronizing. "Good morning, Marcus," she said, settling into the passenger seat of his pickup truck with practiced ease. "How's your brother's wedding planning coming along?" Marcus appreciated Margaret's consistent interest in his family life, her ability to remember details from previous conversations, and follow up on things that mattered to him. "Sarah's getting a little overwhelmed with all the decisions, but David seems happy to let her handle most of the details. I just have to show up, look presentable, and try not to embarrass anyone during my best man speech." "Have you started writing it yet?" Margaret asked as they drove through the morning traffic toward her cardiologist's office. "I've made some notes," Marcus admitted, "but it's harder than I expected. I want to say something meaningful about David and Sarah, but I also want to acknowledge how much my family supported me during my transition back to civilian life. David especially, he's been incredibly patient with me this past year." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "The best speeches come from the heart rather than from elaborate planning. Tell the story of who your brother is as a person and why you believe he and Sarah belong together. The rest will take care of itself." Their conversations during these drives had become one of the highlights of Marcus's week. Margaret had a gift for asking questions that helped him process his experiences and emotions without making him feel like he was in therapy. She shared stories from her own military career and post-retirement years that provided perspective on challenges he was facing, always offering guidance without being preachy or directive. "How's the housing situation coming along?" Margaret asked, referring to a new project Marcus had become involved with at the senior center. "Really well, actually," Marcus replied, his enthusiasm evident in his voice. "We've identified 12 seniors in the community who are struggling to maintain their homes, but can't afford professional repair services. I've been working with a group of other veteran volunteers to organize work parties on weekends. Last Saturday, we replaced a roof, fixed 2 leaking plumbing systems, and installed grab bars in 3 bathrooms." The Housing Assistance Program had grown organically from Marcus's transportation work. As he'd driven people home for medical appointments and shopping trips, he begun noticing the condition of their houses and apartments. Many elderly residents were living in situations that weren't safe or healthy, but lacked the physical ability or financial resources to make necessary improvements. Working with Carol and other center staff, Marcus had helped develop a systematic approach to identifying and addressing housing issues. They partnered with local hardware stores for donated materials, recruited skilled volunteers from various backgrounds, and created a process for prioritizing projects based on safety and urgency. The program had been so successful that other senior centers in the area had reached out for advice on implementing similar initiatives. "You found your calling," Margaret observed as they pulled into the medical center parking lot. "Creating programs that address real needs in the community, organizing resources to solve problems that would otherwise go unaddressed. Those are leadership skills that translate well from military to civilian contexts." Marcus had heard similar observations from other people over the past few months, but coming from Margaret, the comment carried particular weight. She'd become something of a mentor and confidant, someone whose opinion he valued precisely because she understood both military culture and the challenges of civilian transition. "I never thought about it that way," Marcus said, finding a parking space close to the building entrance. "I was just trying to help people who needed help." "That's exactly what good leaders do," Margaret replied. "They see problems that need solving and figure out how to mobilize resources and people to address them effectively. The fact that you don't think of it as leadership just means you're doing it for the right reasons." As they walked toward the medical building entrance, Marcus reflected on how different his life had become since that embarrassing afternoon at the cafe. The hypervigilance and protective instincts that had seemed like obstacles to civilian adjustment had found productive outlets in volunteer work. He still scanned environments and assessed potential problems, but now those habits served useful purposes, identifying safety hazards in elderly people's homes, recognizing signs of depression or isolation among senior center participants, anticipating logistical challenges in community projects. "Margaret," Marcus said as they settled into the cardiologist's waiting room, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," she replied, looking up from the magazine she'd been flipping through. "That day at the cafe, when I made such a mess of trying to help you, did you know immediately that I was military?" "Before I told you," Margaret smiled, the expression carrying both warmth and a hint of mischief. "Marcus, you moved across that cafe with precision and purpose that could only come from military training. Your posture, your scanning behavior, the way you assessed the situation and acted decisively, those were all clear indicators. What I couldn't tell was whether you were active duty or veteran or which branch of service. So you knew I was going to be all wrong about the level of help you actually needed? I knew you were someone who had been trained to respond quickly to potential threats, Margaret said carefully. And I could see that your instincts were telling you I was in danger when I wasn't really in any significant risk. But I also recognized that your intentions were completely honorable, even if your execution was a bit overwhelming. Marcus laughed, still embarrassed by the memory, but able to find humor in it now that time had provided perspective. My brother said I looked like I was trying to prevent a terrorist attack instead of helping someone untangle a purse strap. Your brother wasn't entirely wrong, Margaret admitted with amusement. But here's what I saw that he probably didn't. I saw someone whose protective instincts were so strong that he was willing to risk looking foolish in order to prevent what he believed might be an injury to a stranger. That's not a character flaw, Marcus. That's the kind of person communities need, even when the execution needs some refinement. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse calling Margaret's name, and Marcus settled back in the waiting room chair to read while she had her appointment. As he flipped through a news magazine, his phone buzzed with a text message from Carol at the senior center. Emergency transportation request. The message read, Frank needs ride to hospital. Possible heart attack. Ambulance recommended, but he's refusing. Can you help? Marcus was on his feet immediately, the magazine forgotten as he switched into crisis response mode. Frank was the Vietnam veteran he'd helped with the bookshelf assembly on his first day at the center, and they developed a friendship over the months that followed. Frank was proud and independent, exactly the kind of person who would refuse an ambulance even if he desperately needed medical attention. Marcus quickly explained the situation to the receptionist and asked her to let Margaret know he'd had to leave for an emergency, but would return as soon as possible. Then he was jogging across the parking lot to his truck, already mentally mapping the fastest route to Frank's apartment. The drive to Frank's place took 12 minutes that felt like an hour. Marcus found the elderly veteran sitting on his front porch, pale and sweating, but stubbornly insisting to a frustrated paramedic that he didn't need emergency medical services. Frank, Marcus called out as he approached. What's going on? These people want to take me to the hospital in an ambulance like I'm some kind of invalid, Frank replied, though his voice was weaker than usual and his breathing seemed labored. I told them I just need a ride to my doctor's office, but they won't listen. Marcus knelt down beside Frank's chair, immediately recognizing the signs of someone in significant medical distress who was too proud or scared to admit it. This was exactly the kind of situation where his military training and crisis assessment and his months of experience working with elderly veterans could make a real difference. Frank, help me understand what's happening, Marcus said calmly. Are you having chest pain? Some discomfort, Frank admitted reluctantly. Started about an hour ago. It's probably just indigestion for breakfast. Marcus looked at the paramedic, who shook his head grimly and mouthed the words heart attack while pointing at his portable EKG machine. The situation was serious, but Marcus understood that Frank's resistance to emergency transport probably had as much to do with fear and loss of control as with medical denial. Frank, I'm going to ask you to trust me, Marcus said, maintaining steady eye contact. These paramedics are trained professionals, just like we were in our respective services. They're telling you that you need immediate medical attention, and I believe them. But I also understand why riding in an ambulance feels like giving up your independence. Frank studied Marcus's face, clearly wrestling with conflicting impulses. I hate hospitals. Too many friends went into hospitals and never came out. I understand that fear, Marcus replied. But, Frank, you're not going to get better by sitting here on your porch hoping this goes away. And you're not going to lose your dignity by accepting help when you need it. I'll follow the ambulance to the hospital and stay with you as long as they'll let me. You won't be alone in this. The combination of practical reassurance and emotional support seemed to break through Frank's resistance. He nodded slowly and allowed the paramedics to help him onto the gurney, though he insisted on walking to the ambulance under his own power rather than being carried. Marcus followed the ambulance to the hospital, then spent the next 4 hours in the emergency room and cardiac unit while Frank underwent tests and treatment. It turned out that Frank had indeed suffered a mild heart attack, but prompt medical intervention had prevented serious damage to his heart muscle. The doctors credited the quick response time with significantly improving Frank's prognosis. As Marcus sat in the cardiac unit waiting room, his phone rang. It was Margaret, calling to check on both Frank's condition and Marcus's well-being. "How is he?" she asked without preamble. "Stable," Marcus reported. "The doctors say he's going to be fine, but it really was a heart attack. If he'd waited much longer to get treatment, it could have been much worse. And how are you handling it?" The question surprised Marcus, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Margaret had a way of recognizing when situations might be emotionally challenging for him, particularly those involving life and death decisions or medical crises that might trigger memories of combat experiences. "I'm okay," Marcus said, and realized he genuinely meant it. "Actually, I feel pretty good about how I handled the situation. I was able to stay calm, assess what Frank needed, and help him make a decision that was in his best interest without pressuring him or making him feel like he'd lost control. That's exactly what good leadership looks like in civilian contexts," Margaret said with obvious pride in her voice. "You used your military training to assess a crisis situation, but you adapted your approach to account for Frank's emotional needs and personal dignity. That's sophisticated problem solving that very few people could have managed as effectively." As Marcus reflected on the day's events while driving home that evening, he realized that Margaret was right. The skills that had made him effective as a Marine, crisis assessment, decisive action, concern for others' well-being, had translated directly to civilian situations, but with important modifications he'd learned through months of volunteer work and mentorship. He no longer approached every situation as a potential emergency requiring maximum force responses. Instead, he learned to calibrate his interventions based on actual needs and circumstances to involve other people in decision-making rather than simply taking charge, and to balance immediate problem-solving with longer-term relationship building. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But with guidance from people like Margaret and Carol, opportunities to practice through volunteer work, and the gradual rebuilding of his confidence in civilian contexts, Marcus had found a way to honor his military training while adapting to peacetime service. That night, as Marcus worked on his best man speech for David's wedding, he found himself writing about service and purpose, about the different ways people can protect and support their communities, and about the importance of finding meaningful work that connects individual skills with collective needs. The speech had become less about his brother's romantic relationship and more about the broader theme of building lives that matter, both individually and in service to others. When David read the draft a few days later, he was moved to tears by Marcus's words about finding purpose through service and the importance of supporting each other through difficult transitions. More importantly, David recognized in his brother's writing a sense of peace and direction that had been missing since Marcus's return from deployment. "You sound like yourself again," David said after finishing the speech. "Not the person you were before you joined the Marines, but not someone who's still fighting wars either. Someone who's figured out how to be a veteran in the best possible way." Marcus understood what his brother meant. He'd found a way to maintain the values and skills that military service had given him while adapting them to civilian needs and contexts. The protective instincts that had led him to pour water on Margaret were now channeled into transportation assistance, home repairs, crisis intervention, and community building. The leadership abilities he developed in the Marines were being used to organize volunteer programs, coordinate resources, and mentor other veterans through their own transitions. 6 months after that embarrassing afternoon at the cafe, Marcus had not only learned to navigate civilian life successfully, he'd found a way to make civilian life meaningful and purposeful in ways that honored his military background while serving his community's needs. The elderly woman he doused with water while trying to help had become his mentor, guide, and friend. The crisis of confidence that incident had triggered had become the catalyst for discovering his post-military calling. And the protective instincts that had seemed like obstacles to civilian adjustment had become the foundation for a new kind of service that felt just as important and meaningful as anything he'd done in uniform. On the morning of David's wedding, as Marcus stood before the mirror adjusting his tie and preparing to deliver a speech about love, service, and finding purpose in civilian life, he thought about the unlikely journey that had brought him to this moment. It had started with spilled water and ended with a life rebuilt around service to others. Not every transition from military to civilian life would follow the same path, but Marcus had learned that the skills and values that made someone a good soldier or Marine could also make them a valuable community member, provided they were willing to adapt those qualities to peacetime needs and civilian contexts. As he drove to the wedding venue, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Proud of the man you've become. Enjoy your brother's special day." Marcus smiled and tucked the phone back into his pocket. 6 months ago, he'd been a veteran struggling to find his place in civilian life. Today, he was a community volunteer, a mentor to other transitioning veterans, a reliable friend, and a brother about to celebrate one of the most important days in his family's life. The transformation had been unexpected, challenging, and ultimately more rewarding than anything he could have planned. Sometimes the most embarrassing mistakes became the foundation for the most meaningful growth, and sometimes the people you accidentally inconvenience become the most important guides in your life. Most importantly, Marcus had learned that the end of military service didn't have to mean the end of serving others. It could simply mean finding new ways to use the same values and skills in service of different, but equally important missions. As he pulled into the wedding venue parking lot, Marcus felt grateful not just for his brother's happiness, but for the series of events, starting with spilled water and an elderly woman's patient wisdom, that had led him to discover his own path to purpose and meaning in civilian life.